Hello everyone, welcome back to Lit Compass. In today's lecture, we will discuss the Anglo-Norman period which extends from 1066 to 1350. This period occupies a unique place in English literary history because it marks the transition from Old English to Middle English literature. Unlike the Anglo-Saxon period, which was dominated by heroic ideals and Germanic traditions, the Anglo-Norman period introduced new political systems, new languages, new literary forms, and a completely different cultural outlook. In this lecture, we will examine the historical background, the Norman Conquest, the emergence of a trilingual society, the social and cultural transformations, and finally, the literary significance of this period. So, let's begin with the historical context. This lecture is divided into 6 major sections. We will first examine the historical context leading to the Norman Conquest. Next, we will discuss the Norman invasion and its immediate political consequences. After that, we will see how England became a trilingual society and how the English language was transformed. We will then move on to the social and cultural changes introduced by the Normans. Finally, we will discuss the literary characteristics, important text, and the overall legacy of the Anglo-Norman period. Now, let's move to our first section. To understand the Anglo-Norman period, we must first understand what England looked like before 1066. England was ruled by the Anglo-Saxons. Old English was the dominant language, and Christianity had become the central force shaping society and culture. The turning point came with the death of Edward the Confessor in 1066. Since he died without leaving a direct heir, several individuals claimed the English throne. Harold Godwinson was immediately crowned King of England. At the same time, Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, also claimed the throne. Another claimant was William, Duke of Normandy, who argued that Edward had promised him the English crown. These competing claims created a succession crisis, making England politically unstable and paving the way for the Norman invasion. The Anglo-Norman period extends from 1066 to approximately 1350. It begins with the Norman Conquest and ends with the emergence of Middle English literature. This period is significant because it transformed England in almost every aspect. Politically, Norman rule replaced Anglo-Saxon rule. Linguistically, French and Latin became dominant alongside English. Culturally, new ideas such as chivalry and courtly love entered English society. Literally, new genres such as romance, chronicles, and allegory became popular. Therefore, the Anglo-Norman period is not merely a political period but a major turning point in the evolution of English language and literature. Before William invaded England, the country was already facing political uncertainty. Although Harold Godwinson became king, his position was challenged by Harald Hardrada of Norway and William of Normandy. Harald Hardrada invaded England first but was defeated by Harold at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. However, Harold's victory came at a cost. His army was exhausted after the battle and had to march south immediately to confront William's invading forces. This sequence of events placed Harold at a serious military disadvantage even before the Battle of Hastings began. William, Duke of Normandy, believed that Edward the Confessor had promised him the English throne. To strengthen his claim, he secured the support of Pope Alexander II, giving his invasion religious legitimacy. He spent several months assembling a powerful army consisting of cavalry, archers, and infantry. Unlike the Anglo-Saxon army, William's forces were highly organized and well equipped. His objective was not simply to defeat Harold but to establish permanent Norman rule over England. This careful preparation played a crucial role in his eventual victory. Having understood the historical background and William's preparations, we can now examine the event that changed the course of English history, the Norman Conquest, and its immediate effects. The decisive event of this period was the Battle of Hastings, fought on 14th October 1066. Harold's army relied mainly on infantry and the famous shield wall formation. William, on the other hand, used cavalry, mounted knights, and skilled archers. The Norman forces repeatedly attacked the English lines, eventually breaking the shield wall. Harold Godwinson was killed during the battle and the Anglo-Saxon army collapsed. William's victory secured his claim to the English throne. Later, on 25th December 1066, he was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey, officially beginning Norman rule. The Norman Conquest brought significant political changes. William replaced Anglo-Saxon nobles with Norman aristocrats who were loyal to him. Large estates were confiscated and redistributed among Norman supporters. He strengthened royal authority by introducing a more centralized administrative system. Norman bishops and church officials were appointed, creating a close alliance between the crown and the church. These reforms created a stable but highly hierarchical political system that remained influential for centuries. One of the most lasting consequences of the Norman conquest was linguistic transformation. French became the language of the royal court, government, law, and the aristocracy. Latin continued as the language of religion, education, and scholarship. English remained the language spoken by ordinary people. Although English temporarily lost its social prestige, it continued to evolve by borrowing thousands of French words. Many modern English words relating to law, politics, administration, fashion, and culture entered the language during this period. Instead of replacing English, French enriched its vocabulary and prepared the way for Middle English. As a result of these changes, England became a trilingual society. French was associated with power and the ruling class. Latin was used by the church, scholars, and official institutions. English remained the language of everyday communication among common people. Language also reflected social status. Speaking French often indicated wealth and authority, while English was associated with ordinary life. Over time, interaction between these three languages produced a richer and more flexible English vocabulary. This linguistic blending is one of the defining features of the Anglo-Norman period. The influence of French is still visible in modern English vocabulary. Words related to government include parliament, crown, justice, and government. Words associated with culture include honor, courtesy, literature, and noble. A famous example is found in food terminology. The animals retained their Old English names cow, pig, and sheep because they were raised by English speaking peasants. However, the meat consumed by the Norman nobility adopted French names beef, pork, and mutton. This clearly illustrates how language reflected social class during the Anglo-Norman period. By the end of this period, English had absorbed nearly 10,000 French words, laying the foundation for the rich vocabulary of modern English. Now that we have seen the political and linguistic changes brought by the Norman conquest, let's examine how it transformed English society and culture. The Norman rulers introduced a completely new social order based on feudalism. Society became more hierarchical with the king at the top, followed by nobles, knights, clergy, and peasants. Along with political power, new cultural ideals such as chivalry, courtly manners, and stronger church influence reshaped everyday life. These social changes would later influence the themes, characters, and values of Middle English literature. William the Conqueror reorganized England according to the feudal system. At the top of this pyramid stood the king, who owned all land. He granted land to powerful nobles in return for loyalty and military service. These nobles, in turn, granted portions of land to knights, creating a chain of obligations throughout society. The conquest also led to the emergence of a professional knightly class. Knights received systematic military training, more standardized armor, and followed strict codes of honor and loyalty. At the bottom were the peasants, many of whom were serfs. They were legally tied to the land and had very limited freedom. The Norman system reinforced these social divisions. However, social mobility was not completely impossible. Individuals could improve their status through military service or by joining the church. Since literacy was largely controlled by religious institutions, education became an important pathway to administrative positions. The Norman aristocracy introduced the ideals of chivalry, which became one of the defining features of medieval society. Chivalry emphasized bravery in battle, loyalty to one's lord, personal honor, protection of the weak, and devotion to Christianity. These ideals shaped both the behavior of knights and the literature written about them. Another important development was the tradition of courtly love. Literary works portrayed refined and often idealized romantic relationships between knights and noble women. These stories focused on administration, sacrifice, and noble conduct rather than ordinary romance. Norman castles also became important cultural centers. They supported poets, musicians, and writers, encouraging artistic and literary production. As a result, literature became closely connected with aristocratic life, celebrating heroic adventures, honor, refined manners, music, hunting, and entertainment. The Norman conquest also strengthened the authority of church. Norman kings maintained a close partnership with the church. In return for recognizing the king's authority, the church received protection, privileges, and influence in both religious and political affairs. Monasteries and cathedral schools became major centers of education and manuscript production. Since the printing press had not yet been invented, monks carefully copied books by hand, preserving both religious and classical knowledge. Religious literature flourished during this period. Writers produced saints' lives, biblical retellings, sermons, and theological commentaries in Latin, French, and gradually in English. Because the clergy controlled education and literacy, the church exercised enormous cultural influence. It shaped moral values, preserved learning, and strongly influenced the themes and purposes of medieval literature. Having understood the political, social, and cultural background, we can now look at the literature produced during the Anglo-Norman period. This literature reflected the values of feudal society, Christianity, and the Norman aristocracy. Writers experimented with new literary forms while continuing some earlier English traditions. The multilingual environment, French, Latin, and English, also influenced literary production, resulting in a rich and diverse literary culture. The most popular literary form of the Anglo-Norman period was the Romance. Romances told adventurous stories of brave knights, noble ladies, magical events, and heroic quests. They combined action, romance, chivalry, and supernatural elements, usually written in verse. Another important form was allegory. In allegorical works, characters and events symbolized moral or spiritual ideas, teaching religious and ethical lessons through symbolic storytelling. Religious literature remained highly significant. Saints' lives, biblical stories, devotional writings, and theological works continued to dominate literary production because religion was central to medieval life. Historical writing also developed through chronicles. These works recorded the history of kings, important events, and national achievements, blending factual history with literary style. Finally, the language of literature reflected England's multilingual society. French dominated aristocratic literature, Latin remained the language of scholarship and religion, while English gradually re emerged as a literary language. Over time, these three languages influenced one another, enriching English vocabulary and preparing the way for Middle English literature. So far, we have explored how the Norman conquest transformed England politically, socially, culturally, and linguistically. Now, we can discuss the major authors and literary figures of Anglo-Norman period. Several writers played key roles in shaping Anglo-Norman literature. The first is Lyman, an English priest active during the late 12th century. His masterpiece, Brut, adapted earlier French histories into English and narrated the legendary history of Britain. Lyman successfully bridged French literary traditions with the emerging English language, making him an important transitional figure. Next is Mary de France, one of the earliest known female poets in European literature. She composed the famous Lies, a collection of 12 short narrative poems inspired by Breton folklore. Her stories combine romance, courtly love, psychological insight, and the supernatural elements. Mary's sophisticated storytelling established her as one of the finest writers of the period. Another important writer is Ohm, author of the Ormulum. Ohm produced an extensive verse paraphrase of the Gospels with theological commentary. His work is especially valuable because it demonstrates the growing literary use of English and even introduced a unique spelling system to improve pronunciation. Finally, we have the anonymous author of Angrin Vitae. This prose guide was written for women living religious lives in seclusion. It combines practical advice with spiritual instruction and is admired for its refined English prose and thoughtful exploration of female spirituality. Now let's look at some of the masterpieces of the Anglo-Norman period. The first is Brut by Lyman. Containing over 16,000 lines, it tells the legendary history of Britain from the Trojan founder Brutus to the Anglo-Saxon period. More than a historical narrative, it helped shape ideas of British identity and national history. Next are the Lies by Mary de France. These 12 narrative poems revolve around themes of love, adventure, honor, and magic. Drawing from Breton folklore, they combine emotional depth with literary elegance and remain classics of medieval romance. Another remarkable work is Ormulum. This enormous religious poem consists of nearly 20,000 lines. It paraphrases biblical text while explaining Christian teachings. Beyond its religious significance, it provides valuable evidence of the development of the English language. We also have Angrin Vitae, a guide for religious women. Unlike many medieval religious texts, it is written in clear and elegant English prose, making theology accessible to ordinary readers while emphasizing personal devotion and spiritual discipline. Finally, the Anglo-Norman chronicles deserve special attention. Writers such as Geoffrey of Monmouth, Weiss, and others blended historical facts with legendary narratives. Their works popularized the legends of King Arthur and profoundly influenced later medieval literature. The Anglo-Norman period had a lasting impact on English language and literature. Historically, the Norman Conquest transformed England's linguistic landscape. Old English gradually evolved into Middle English through continuous interaction with Norman French. Linguistically, thousands of French words entered English. Even today, a significant portion of English vocabulary, especially words related to law, government, art, cuisine, and literature, has Norman French origins. Literally, the period introduced sophisticated genres such as romance, allegory, and refined historical writing. These innovations expanded the possibilities of English literature and encouraged the growth of vernacular writing. Culturally, although the Norman conquest began as a military invasion, it eventually led to the blending of Norman and Anglo-Saxon traditions. This cultural fusion helped shape a distinct English identity. Most importantly, the Anglo-Norman period prepared the ground for later literary giants like Geoffrey Chaucer. By proving that English could express complex ideas, emotions, and artistic beauty, Anglo-Norman writers made the flourishing of Middle English literature possible. Thus, the years between 1066 and 1350 represent not merely a transitional phase but one of the foundational periods in the history of English literature. So that's all for today's class. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video. Happy learning.